They told me it was just a small family dinner to welcome me back. My aunt's voice on the phone was warm, almost gentle. The kind of warm that should have made me suspicious right away, because she hadn't spoken to me like that in 4 years. My name is Isla, and I'm 31 years old. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in East Vancouver, which is a nice way of saying I have a view of the alley behind a Vietnamese restaurant, and I can hear my neighbor's TV through the wall every night. I have 2 rescue cats, a sourdough starter I've kept alive for 3 years, and a business that, as of last spring, employs 42 people across British Columbia. Nobody in my family knows about the last part. It started the way most disasters in my life have started, with my mother-in-law calling my aunt. Those 2 women have been in contact since my marriage to her son. My ex-husband fell apart 2 years ago. I don't know exactly what they talk about. I imagine it involves a lot of sighing and sentences that begin with "the problem with Isla is." My aunt left a voicemail on a Tuesday afternoon. "We miss you," she said. "Your uncle and I, your cousins. We thought maybe a nice dinner, just the close family somewhere downtown. We want to put everything behind us." She paused. "Your mother would have wanted this." That last part was deliberate. My mother passed away 3 years ago, 8 months before my divorce was finalized. My aunt knows exactly how to use that. She has always known. I called her back the next morning. She sounded so reasonable. 6 people, she said. Herself, my uncle, my 2 cousins, and maybe my cousin's partner. A restaurant called Archer's on Robson Street. Saturday at 7. I told her I'd think about it. I told myself I wouldn't go. I went. I drove downtown on a gray October Saturday, parked in the lot on Thurlow, and sat in my car for 4 minutes listening to a podcast about Antarctic expeditions, because I needed to feel like whatever I was about to walk into could not possibly be as bad as being stranded on sea ice. Then I turned it off, put on my coat, and walked to Archer's. Archer's is the kind of restaurant where the menu doesn't have prices on the version they hand to certain guests. I knew it by reputation. I'd actually had a business dinner there in September with a supplier from Montreal. The tasting menu ran about $220 a person, before wine. I pushed open the door and immediately understood that I had made a mistake. It wasn't 6 people, it was 14. My aunt was there, yes, and my uncle, but so were my 2 cousins and their partners, my uncle's brother and his wife who I haven't spoken to since my wedding, 3 people I recognized as neighbors of my aunt's from Burnaby who I've met maybe twice in my life. And standing at the far end of the table looking at his phone, my ex-husband's younger brother. They had already ordered. I could see the bread on the table, a charcuterie board that had clearly just been set down, and 3 open bottles of wine. A server was coming back with what looked like a second round of cocktails. My aunt stood up and opened her arms. "Isla, you look wonderful. Come, sit. We saved you a seat." I sat down. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. Or that specific paralysis that happens when you walk into a situation so different from what you expected that your brain genuinely takes a few seconds to catch up to your body. My cousin leaned over and poured me a glass of wine without asking. "We started without you, hope that's okay," she said. Which was funny because it clearly was not a question. The dinner went on. People talked. My uncle told a long story about renovating his deck. My aunt asked me whether I was still at that little food company, which is what she has called my business since I started it. That little food company, in a tone that implies it's somewhere between a hobby and a cry for help. I said yes. She nodded with the particular expression of someone storing away information for later. Halfway through the main course I realized I had not seen a menu. I had been handed bread and a plate of something the server described as sablefish with a smoked corn broth, and I had eaten it because I was hungry and confused, and the table's energy had a kind of current running through it that made me feel like any disruption would be bad. The wine kept coming. I counted the bottles. By the time the dessert menus came out, there were 7 empty bottles on the table, plus 2 that were still going. I recognized the label on one of them. It was a Burgundy I'd seen on Archer's wine list in September. That bottle was $340. I did not order dessert. I was calculating in my head, and I did not like the numbers I was arriving at. After the dessert plates were cleared, my uncle set down his napkin and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy. "Isla," he said, "I want you to know we've all talked and we feel terrible about how distant things have gotten. Your family, and we want to be there for you." Several people at the table nodded. My ex-husband's brother was nodding. "That's really kind," I said. "So we thought," my aunt said, picking it up like they'd practiced the handoff. Since we haven't all been together in so long and since tonight was about reconnecting, you'd want to take care of the bill, as a gesture, to show that you're ready to move forward with the family. The table went quiet. Not the whole restaurant. Just our table. I looked at my aunt, then at my uncle, then slowly around the 14 faces watching me. I'm sorry, I said. Say that again? My aunt smiled, not warmly. The bill, Isla. We thought you'd cover it. You're doing so well with your little company. This is your chance to show the family you're serious about coming back. My cousin, the one who had poured me wine without asking, added, It's not that much, it's a nice gesture. I picked up my water glass. I took a very slow sip. Here is what they did not know about me. 4 years ago, when my marriage ended and I left the house my ex-husband and I had rented in Coquitlam, I took my car, my cats, my mother's Le Creuset pot, and approximately $900 in my personal checking account. I was 37 days late on my car insurance. I slept on a friend's couch in Mount Pleasant for 6 weeks. What I did not tell anyone, including my aunt, including my mother before she died, including anyone in that family, was what happened next. Because what happened next was mine, and I had learned the hard way that the moment you share something good with certain people, they will find a way to make it about themselves, or take a piece of it, or use it to measure your worth against your willingness to give it away. I had started making dog treats. That's how it began. I was broke, I had a background in food science from BCIT, and I had 2 rescue cats and a friend with 3 dogs, and I was looking at pet food labels one day and thinking, I can do better than this. I started at the East Van Farmers Market with a folding table and a cash box. I made biscuits out of pumpkin and oat and flaxseed. I called them Bramble & Co., which I named partly after the blackberry brambles in my friend's backyard, and partly because it sounded like something trustworthy. By the end of the first year, I had a commercial kitchen rental in East Vancouver and 12 wholesale accounts with independent pet stores across the Lower Mainland. By the second year, I had moved into a leased production facility in Burnaby, hired 8 people, and launched a direct-to-consumer subscription box. By the third year, I had expanded into Ontario and Alberta, signed a distribution agreement with a national pet supply chain, and taken on a small amount of investor capital to fund the expansion, the first outside money I'd ever accepted, and I negotiated every term myself. As of October I walked into Archer's restaurant on Robson Street, Bramble & Co. had 42 employees, a new facility in Kelowna, and a pending deal with a grocery chain that would put our products in 260 stores across Canada. The pending deal was the reason I was in downtown Vancouver that Saturday at all. I had a meeting the next morning at 9 with the chain's Western regional buyer. I had driven in from a trade show in Abbotsford and was staying at a hotel 4 blocks from Archer's. My aunt did not know any of this. She thought I was still at my little food company. I set my water glass down. I looked at the table. I looked at my ex-husband's brother, who was watching me with the comfortable expression of someone who expects to be entertained. I picked up the small leather folder the server had quietly placed beside me at some point. Apparently I had been designated before I even arrived. I opened it. The total was $4,380 before tip. I closed the folder. I set it gently on the table in front of me. Then I excused myself to use the restroom. I walked through the restaurant, down the back hallway, and found the hostess station near the kitchen entrance. I asked for the manager on duty. A woman in her mid-30s came out within 2 minutes. Efficient, professional. The kind of person who's good at reading situations. Her name tag said Renee, which I remember because I glanced at it while I was gathering my thoughts. I need to split the bill, I said quietly. I'll pay for myself and one other person. The rest of the table needs to be charged separately, split evenly among the remaining 13 guests on individual cards. She looked at me for a moment, not unkindly. The reservation was made with a note that the bill would be going to one card, she said. I know, I said. That note was made without my knowledge or consent. I'm happy to pay my portion and one guest. The rest needs to be divided. She nodded slowly. I'll need a moment to restructure it in the system. Take all the time you need, I said. I'll be back at the table. I walked back to my seat. My aunt was in the middle of a story about her neighbor's new deck. Apparently decks were a theme of the evening. I sat down and poured myself the last inch of water from the carafe. About 12 minutes later, the server appeared at the table with a small stack of leather folders. He set one in front of table, placing one in front of each adult. The table went very still. My uncle looked at the folder in front of him. Then at me. What is this? Your portion of the bill, I said. My aunt's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession. Isla, we discussed this. You discussed it, I said, among yourselves before I arrived without asking me. That's not a discussion. That's an ambush. You're being dramatic, my cousin said, but she wasn't looking at me. She was opening her folder and looking at the number inside with an expression I found very satisfying. My uncle's brother, the one I hadn't spoken to since my wedding, made a sound that I can only describe as a bark. $380? For one dinner? 7 bottles of wine between 14 people adds up, I said pleasantly. My ex-husband's brother put his folder down and looked at me. You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you, he said. It wasn't a question. I had a good idea, I said. What happened next was not quiet. My aunt's voice went up. My uncle put his hand on her arm in the way that means he's embarrassed but also agrees with her. My cousin said several things that I will not repeat here. The couple from Burnaby, my aunt's neighbors, who I barely knew, who had apparently signed on to a free dinner and were now looking at a bill for their share of 7 bottles of wine and a 3-course tasting menu, were having a very rapid, very tense conversation in lowered voices. The manager came back to the table herself. She was calm and direct. Each bill was accurate, she confirmed. Each person was responsible for their portion. If anyone had concerns about what they'd ordered, she was happy to review the itemized list. My uncle tried briefly to argue that there must have been a misunderstanding. The manager said, gently but without any give in her voice, that the restaurant had a record of the reservation note and the modification request made this evening, and that the current arrangement was correct. I left $460 on the table, my portion of the food, my portion of the wine I had actually drunk, 1 glass, and 20% on top. I thanked the manager as I passed the hostess stand. I got my coat from the hook by the door. My aunt came after me into the foyer. I could hear her heels on the hardwood. You just humiliated this entire family, she said. I turned around. She was flushed, and her expression was the one I remembered from childhood. The one that meant she had decided something was my fault and no evidence would change that. I drove downtown for what you told me was a dinner for 6 people, I said. I walked in to find 14. You'd already ordered. You had already apparently decided I would pay for all of it. And no one thought to mention that to me until after the dessert plates were cleared. You could afford it, she said. You're doing fine. That's not the point. It's a family dinner, Isla. It's what family does. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about my mother. I thought about the $900 in my checking account 4 years ago. I thought about the 42 people who showed up to work at my facility in Burnaby every week, and the grocery chain buyer I was meeting at 9 the next morning, and the bramble bushes in my friend's backyard, where this whole thing had started. I'm going to tell you something, I said, not because I owe you an explanation, but because I want you to understand why what you did tonight was a particularly bad idea. She crossed her arms. Bramble & Co. I said, that's my company. The little food company, it does pretty well. 42 employees, distribution across 3 provinces, and as of next week, 260 grocery stores nationally if the meeting I have tomorrow morning goes the way I expect it to. She stared at me. The reason I didn't tell anyone, I said, is because of exactly this. Because the first thing that happens when people find out something is going well for me is that they decide that means they're owed something. And I'm done funding other people's ideas about what I owe them. My aunt opened her mouth, closed it. The bill tonight was $4,380, I said. I paid $460. That's my share. Everyone else paid their own. That's fair. I put on my coat. I hope the rest of the dinner was good, I said. The sablefish was excellent. I walked out onto Robson Street. The air was cold and sharp the way Vancouver gets in October, that particular clean cold that comes off the mountains and cuts straight through whatever you're wearing. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. My phone started going in my pocket about 3 minutes later. I looked at the screen. My aunt. I let it go to voicemail, then my cousin, then a number I didn't recognize, which was probably my uncle's brother. I walked back to my hotel. That night I ordered room service, a bowl of pho from a place 2 blocks away that delivered until midnight, because I am a person who knows her city, and I sat at the small desk in my room and reviewed my notes for the morning meeting. The regional buyer's name was Harpreet. We'd been emailing for 6 weeks. I had a deck prepared, samples packed in a cooler in the trunk of my car, and a margin analysis I'd revised 3 times. I went to sleep at 10:30. The meeting the next morning lasted 2 hours and 12 minutes. Harpreet was sharp, detail-oriented, and asked exactly the kind of questions that told me she'd actually read everything I'd sent. We went through the product range, the production capacity, the shelf life testing data. She asked about our allergen protocols. I walked her through our facility certification. At 11:40 she said, "We'd like to move forward with a full category review. I'll send you the formal proposal by end of week." I shook her hand. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button for the lobby. I stood there very still and allowed myself exactly 10 seconds of something that I can only describe as profound, quiet satisfaction. The specific feeling of work done so carefully and for so long finally becoming something real. Then the doors opened and I walked out into the lobby. My aunt called again that afternoon. This time I answered, because I had driven back over the bridge, and I was on the highway and I had the energy for it now that the meeting was behind me. "I want you to know," she said without saying hello, "that your uncle had to put $340 on his credit card last night because of you. He is on a fixed income. He drank 3 glasses of a $340 bottle of wine," I said. "That's roughly $115 a glass." His choice, silence. "You have changed," my aunt said. "Yes," I said, "I have. This isn't who you were raised to be." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about my mother, who was a practical woman, a nurse for 31 years, who used to say that the most dangerous phrase in any family is "we assumed." She said it more than once. She said it specifically about my aunt. "I was raised by my mother," I said, "not by you, and she taught me to pay what I owe and not a dollar more." My aunt said nothing. "I'm on the highway," I said. "I have to go." I hung up. I drove home through the tunnel, past the farms on the flat land between the highway and the Fraser, past the turnoff for my production facility, past the exit for my apartment. I took the long way, the one that adds 12 minutes but goes along the river. I got home, fed my cats, and made tea. 3 days later, a reporter from a Vancouver small business publication called me. Someone had passed along my name in connection with a tip about the Bramble & Co. grocery chain deal, which had somehow gotten out before the formal announcement. I spent 40 minutes on the phone with her. The article ran on the following Tuesday. My aunt called that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. The message lasted 2 minutes and 30 seconds. She said she'd had no idea. She said she was proud of me. She said she hoped we could move forward as a family. She said, near the end, that she'd always believed in me. I saved the voicemail, not to play it back, just because I find it useful to have accurate records. The grocery deal closed on a Thursday in November, 11 days after the meeting with Harpreet. I found out at 7 in the morning when the formal email came through, and I sat at my kitchen table in my housecoat with my older cat on my lap, and the younger one trying to steal the corner of my toast, and I read the email twice. Then I made another cup of tea. I did not call my aunt. I did not call my uncle. I did not call my cousin or the neighbors from Burnaby, or my ex-husband's brother. I called my operations manager in Burnaby and told her to tell the team. I heard the noise from the production floor through the phone. A kind of collective shout. The kind that happens when people who have worked hard for a long time find out it meant something. That sound was enough. Some debts are real and some are invented, and the people who invent them are usually very good at making you feel like you're the one who's wrong for noticing the difference. I spent a long time not noticing. I spent a long time paying for things that were never actually mine before. I'm 31 years old. I live in East Vancouver with 2 rescue cats and a sourdough starter, and a company that, as of this November, sells in 260 grocery stores across Canada. I paid $460 at Archer's restaurant on a Saturday night in October, not a dollar more.